Wow. Well, thanks for having me first. This is, of course, a fascinating group and a fascinating venue. Really grateful to George for the invitation, also to Bina and Christina for joining us for the discussion. I'm, of course, a cultural anthropologist. I study the worldviews of nuclear waste experts in Finland and also the United States. And I do so by participating in and observing their everyday habits. So I interview them, I take elaborate notes, and I try to understand how Finland's nuclear waste experts see the world. So from 2012 to 2014, I spent 32 months doing this in Finland. I recorded over 120 interviews with geologists, with managers, with chemists, with physicists, lawyers, engineers, politicians, regulators, activists, banking professionals, and also members of the public. Last fall, MIT Press released my book on this topic, as George just held up, called Deep Time Reckoning. And what interests me in that book is how these experts I came to know deal with incredibly long-lived radioactive isotopes, and how deep time is kind of papered into their everyday office lives. So plutonium-239, for instance, has a half-life of 24,100 years. Uranium-235's half-life is over 700 million years. So with these really long-term futures in view, today I'm gonna kind of explore how Finland's nuclear waste experts have folded these sequences of scenarios and hopes and calculations and fears and data sets and dreams and models and anxieties and all sorts of dimensions of social life and technical inquiry, and how they folded them together to make visions of Finland's distant future, and that express themselves as these kind of mundane, everyday banal artifacts of technocratic paperwork. So anthropological exploration of this unique long-termist work, I believe, can help widen the temporal frames of mass society. And nurturing this kind of public time literacy is, after all, something that I argue is increasingly vital as our planet's ecological crisis becomes complicated by a deflation of popular enthusiasm for liberal arts education and for scientific inquiry. So while doing fieldwork in Finland, my interest was in the everyday work lives of the country's uniquely long-sighted nuclear waste repository safety case experts. So who are they? Well, they developed models of geological, hydrological, and ecological events that could potentially occur in Western Finland over the coming tens of thousands or even hundreds of thousands of years in the future. Safety case experts routinely reckoned with distant future glaciations and climate changes and earthquakes and floods and human and animal population changes and more. The goal was to develop a portfolio of evidence to support Finland's nuclear industry's license application for a government permit to begin formal construction of this now famous repository. The repository is going to be located about 400 or 450 meters underground on the island of Olkiluoto in the Gulf of Bothnia in the Baltic Sea. Finland's Nuclear Regulatory Authority, STUK, approved this safety case in 2015. And then soon after, Finland's Ministry of Employment and the Economy issued the Finnish nuclear waste management company Posiva, who's kind of the architect of this project, and it's owned by Finland's domestic nuclear companies, Teolle Ydinvoima, TVO, and Fortum, issued them a construction license. So that made Finland the first country in the world to get to this stage of licensing a spent nuclear fuel repository. And sometime in the next few years, the Olkiluoto repository is very likely to begin accepting waste. Now, critical social scientists like me are usually quite quick to brush off these long-term repository safety assessment models as reductive constructions or epistemic oversimplifications or hubris, right? And they definitely have a point in a way, because predicting distant futures is an impossible task. It can't be done. Geology is a retrodictive science, usually, not a predictive science in many geologists' rendering. That's a point of contention that I often ran into when I was conducting fieldwork. However, as an anthropologist, I see my job as trying to kind of peek inside my informant's worldviews and then kind of critically apprehend how their thinking's internal logics works, and that, no matter how irrational they may initially seem. And early on in this thought experiment, when I'm in Finland doing this, something becomes quite clear to me. Most of my informants pretty much agree with me that their task is impossible. They see it as sort of obvious that their models are reductive or subjective or significantly mediated by present day history and culture. They saw their models of Finland's far future as highly sophisticated, educated guesses, the most credible forecast that they can devise using the best science and technology that's available to them. And my new book takes these kind of pragmatic futurologies seriously. Its goal is not to advocate for some naive realism or scientism or positivism and reckoning the far future absolutely perfectly. And I don't take a stance on whether nuclear energy is a suitable climate solution either. I just kind of don't address that question. And then I focus on the deep time reckoning dimension. The book simply argues that safety case experts' mission of embarking on these kind of distant future modeling projects in this kind of self-reflective spirit can sort of offer guidance or inform us during our current moment of global ecological devastation. So the question is how anthropological methods can be used to kind of mine safety case expert thinking for strategies or and sort of threads of thought that experts and publics alike can kind of adopt to teach themselves to become more skilled deep time reckoners. And I call these strategies in my book reckonings, and I end each chapter with about 5 or 6 of them. So each reckoning is kind of a takeaway guidance that I leave behind each step of the way as I follow the safety case experts into far future Finlands. And cultivating this kind of societal time literacy can help us resist 2 of today's most dismal global crises. The first is the Anthropocene. That's a name, unofficial name currently, though it's moving forward and it's towards being verified, hopefully. It's a name proposed for a troubled epoch in Earth's history, ushered in by human transformations of our planet's climate, erosion patterns, extinction, atmosphere, rock record, and more. The Anthropocene proposal challenges entire populations to reimagine their ways of thinking, acting, and dwelling to better sync with Earth's radical long-term. A second crisis, however, I think is creating new obstacles to this. And in my book, I call it the deflation of expertise. Over the past few years in the United States and Western Europe and beyond, political power has been increasingly gained through nationalist populist mockery of expert virtues of meticulousness or cautious speech. We see this with vaccine science, even before coronavirus, anti-vaxxers, stem cell research, climate change models, ballot counts, critical social theories, cell phone radiation studies, pandemic disease alerts, human evolution research. They're all routinely attacked in these kind of frenzied cable news free-for-alls and social media echo chambers. So you have Oxford English Dictionary naming post-truth its 2016 word of the year. Alternative fact and fake news are now kind of mainstream buzzwords. And in this setting, it strikes kind of a different chord when social theorists like me start critiquing the hegemony of realism or truth or facthood as times change. So increasingly, these same kind of analytical strategies of deconstructing scientific knowledge are increasingly used by populists to sow doubt about future-gazing climate change models or coronavirus epidemiological models. Today, expert voices are increasingly drowned out by Twitter mobs. They're dulled by corporate knowledge management red tape. They're exhausted by adjunctification hiring trends at universities, as well as these kind of bloated and costly university administrative structures. They're warped by short-term contingent gig economy research funding contracts that are increasingly pervasive, and they're rushed by publish or perish productivity pressures. As public enthusiasm for liberal arts education and scientific inquiry deflates, societies enter in this kind of state of futurelessness or futureless liminality, I say in my book. This is kind of defined by this manic fixation on the present moment that kind of shoots down proposals for envisioning better worlds. And all of this occurs in a reckless age, as Bina's wonderful book puts it. Yet looking Earth's radical long-term in the eye is now a pressing societal task at the same time, despite the fact that it seems to be more difficult. And that's why I wrote Deep Time Reckoning in accessible prose, right? What's needed is more stable bridges between the social and the natural sciences, between experts and non-experts, between diverse cultures inhabiting a damaged planet that for many is feeling a lot less like a friendly global village with each passing day. So in this spirit, I ask, can collaborative engagement with safety case experts help us resist this deflation of expertise? And to answer this question, I first had to study Finland's 21st century cultural dynamics anthropologically. I had to examine which aspects of Finnish culture were laying groundwork for safety case experts to make bold journeys across time without kind of caving to onslaughts of public criticism, as they would in other cultural settings. So what did I find? Well, Finns from many walks of life described to me how their countries has kind of a warmth to this sort of centralized hierarchical organizations like nuclear power plants or public transport systems or government ministries of the welfare state. Some point to polls casting Finland as unique in the high levels of trust its population places in domestic civil servants, researchers and police are highly trusted in Finland, educators are highly trusted in Finland, pilots and engineers. Others pointed to Finland's lack of historical experience with domestic techno-scientific disasters like Bhopal or the BP oil spill, though the Chernobyl cloud did unfortunately go up to northern Finland and affect reindeer herding Sami populations in the 80s. But no large-scale domestic techno-scientific disaster has struck. So Finnish social scientists, they're telling me of Finland's trust in technology's ability to produce welfare, in the strong position of its administrative bodies, in the involvement of academic intellectuals in creating Finland's national ideologies. Technocrats in Finland's Ministry of Employment and the Economy are among the most trusted figures in the country. And compare that to the US, where bureaucrat or technocrat are four-letter words for a lot of people. Now, that's not to say there wasn't domestic critique or anti-nuclear activism in Finland. Some criticize Finland's icon of the virtually infallible engineer. Others criticize their compatriots for kind of uncritically embracing Enlightenment scientism and the dictates of state authorities. Some host demonstrations like the Olkiluoto blockades, where activists block roads surrounding the Olkiluoto nuclear power plant. And Greenpeace even places this huge monument of selfishness in a Helsinki park. And that lists the names of these parliament members who recently voted for expanding Finland's nuclear capacity. In 1980, the Finnish rock band Epu Normaali wrote an ironic song titled Suomi Ilmiö, that translates to the Finnish syndrome, a play on the China syndrome, which criticizes Finns' culture of nuclear trust. And actually, a lot of the band members from Epu Normaali are now pro-nuclear activists on climate grounds, which is interesting. But the song left a mark on Finland too, and does to this day. So that said, safety case work is largely non-politicized, right? The NIMBY, not in my backyard politicking that stopped the US Yucca Mountain repository project in its tracks in 2009 is just not strongly present in Finland in the way that it is elsewhere in France or the UK or Canada, Germany, Switzerland, elsewhere. They've all seen these political stagnations that have stalled their repository projects, right? So Finland's able to hold closely to this repository construction schedule that it set all the way back in the early 1980s. But let's not idealize Finnish expertise culture too much, right? I mean, we can't go over the top here. Finnish colleague, humanities colleague, always lamented to me how Finland's consensus valorizing debate culture makes for really boring, non-adversarial, agreeable talk radio. And to her, this is something that deters healthy societal critique. A Finnish social scientist once told me, quote, hyperbolically, of course, in Finland, you get to observe a near total embrace of Foucauldian discipline and governmentality. Certain aspects of the deflation of expertise are alive in Finland too. Finland's Talvivaara mine wastewater leaks unfortunately spread nickel and cadmium and zinc, uranium and aluminum into Eastern Finland's ecosystems since starting, I think, around 2012. And then there was this high profile criminal case after And it causes many people in Finland to start wondering, okay, does Finland's domestic extractive industry really work in my interests? Um, and you start to see shreds of dissatisfaction with expertise culture in Finland too. The scientist at VTT Technical Research Center of Finland starts lamenting to me how research today is diluted by private interests of commercial and investment capital, workplace audits of research deliverables. I talked to someone else at Finland's Geological Survey. I get a whole 2-hour-long interview about how he spends so much time doing paperwork, he never gets anything done. He's reporting to these non-scientist managers who are paid a lot more than he is, despite having like a bachelor's degree in business or something, rather than a PhD in physics. And they're always applying for funding. They never do actual research, right? But none of this really compares to the maelstrom of discontent surrounding expert inquiry that I witnessed when I returned to the US in August 2014. And this kind of puts Finland's expertise culture and expertise politics into perspective for me, right? So in time, I become increasingly optimistic, and as I'm writing this book, that Finland's safety case experts' spirit of modesty and pragmatism and self-reflection can offer us some guidance here. So I started asking in the book, can anthropological engagement with Finland's safety case experts help mass societies kind of widen intellectual time horizons during this moment of ecological destruction that some call Anthropocene? And can taking their uniquely long-sighted worldviews seriously help kind of be re-engineered into something that educated publics can use to resist this deflation of expertise and a crisis of short-termism we're seeing today? So let's take a little field trip into far future Finland's and see what I mean. So the safety case is an interesting thing. It details the Olkiluoto repository's technical design. It reports on engineering principles and strategies, contains all these interwoven quantitative models and qualitative scenarios forecasting the underground facilities fate over the coming millennia. And in my book, I explore how Finland, sort of these biosphere experts, biosphere assessment experts, for example, they're modelers, systems analysis modelers, how they make projections about Western Finland's lakes, rivers, mires, forests, etc., sprouting up and disappearing and changing shape and size over the next 10 millennia. The experts consider far future soil erosion, floods, and fires. They envision a 3-kilometer thick glacial ice sheet during the next ice age, which is slated to occur 50 or 60,000 years from now. They envision potential seismic events, earthquakes, and rock shears that could occur as the ice sheet retreats after the next ice age. And then they model how the current Olkiluoto island site will eventually become an inland site. In their models, glacial rebound from the last ice age eventually causes Finland's shoreline to kind of widen further out into the Baltic Sea, and this kind of leads the little tiny islet to join and become part of Finland's mainland. And then they explore all these kind of pessimistic and unlikely scenarios as well. They model how 14 different kinds of radionuclides could sort of conceivably escape from the repository's engineered barriers and then travel through groundwater flows and underground rock fractures in the crystalline granite bedrock there. Then they kind of model pathways, how they get released at various points on Earth's surface, and how they disperse in these above ground ecosystems and bioaccumulate in plants and animals along the way. And all these models kind of link together into some organic whole where you can watch the migration of the radionuclides from repository depth to surface onto dinner tables and well water, into well water. So my book also kind of starts exploring how the kind of epistemology of the biosphere assessors, they make these conservative assumptions, they call them, that 6,000 far future people all eating local food are going to live in Western Finland. Their models suggest that some of them, which is a critical group of them, are going to face a greater likelihood of exposure due to unlucky food selections. They literally model someone going out, having the worst possible food selections from the woods, coming back, another one going out, having the second worst food selections. That's how they isolate this critical group, right? And then they say that, okay, all of these hypothetical future people are going to be safely below Stooks, that's the nuclear regulator's stringent regulatory dose limits, even under these very unlikely circumstances. So that's kind of the rhetorical structure of how the safety case works, right? Its goal is to persuade ultimately, but mobilize a heck of a lot of PhDs and a whole heck of a lot of money and resources in order to do so. So these are really Promethean labors, right? But reckoning with deep time, I've noticed also it requires this level of humility too. And that's what's felt kind of counterintuitive when I was there. Safety case experts, central to their work is integrating this kind of self-criticism or self-reflection or self-deprecation. A lot of people say the Finns are very self-deprecating people, and they also integrate vast amounts of uncertainty into their own models and reports. They even make reports with names like knowledge quality assessment, where they basically criticize their own knowledge, or in sensitivity analysis, how accurate are the parameters and how sensitive are the inputs we're putting into our deep time models in affecting the final result if they're not sound. So safety case expertise is also about admitting to and then kind of systematically detailing reductive assumptions found in their knowledge base, rather than trying to conceal them. And that's where its plausibility and its credibility comes from. And it's very different than the total system performance assessment models the Department of Energy did for the Yucca Mountain project. So the safety case doesn't really put forth this one kind of overconfident model that's assumed to perfectly represent the one far future that's going to happen. Though there is one model, the performance assessment model, that is kind of the primary scenario that they see as most likely. Rather, it takes this multiplicitous series of projections about all these potential future events, and it kind of weights them with different likelihoods of occurring. Like there's a base case or most likely scenario, then there's a variant case or reasonably likely scenario, or a disturbance case, or that's a pretty unlikely scenario. And other terminologies are used as well, right? So a reference case, most likely, sensitivity case, some negative future variant events are put in a model. What if cases are unlikely, and then worst case scenarios, they make those too. So as my informants saw it, these kind of multiple parallel visions of tomorrow can tell us something, but surely not everything about far future Finland. There's this multi-temporal, multi-timescale, multi-perspectival, multidisciplinary sensibility is something that I think is useful. So I turn it into these end of the chapter reckonings that I kind of spin off as takeaways, right? So one's about multiple lines of evolution, my informants called it. This is all about venturing kind of these multi-pronged visions of potential future worlds and always making sure you're doing this in the plural. There is no future world, singular. The second reckoning is about self-critique that doesn't paralyze action. You have to cautiously apply scientific rationality to far futures. And you can add some structure to your thoughts when doing so. This can help overcome these feelings of meaninglessness or awe or mystery or terror or anxiety that well up when we gaze into the abyss of deep time. But you also have to make sure you never trick yourself into thinking the work is ever complete. So my informants adopted a stepwise approach of progressively developing new and improved and updated versions of the safety case that grow more robust over the years, right? They call these iterations. Each iteration is a work in progress, and new iterations are released every 10 or 15 years, and they're going to be released until the repository is decommissioned, once they put all the waste in and shut it down. And that's going to happen in 2120, if the schedule goes according to schedule. So that will be the last safety case. And as technology advances, there should be a pretty high resolution vision of far future Finland's, hopefully. So the next one they're working on is the operating license application, first in the world, also scheduled for submission later this year. People say that's a little ambitious. So another kind of takeaway reckoning in my book is about multiple lines of reasoning. It's all about, bringing together teams of experts, each with different disciplinary backgrounds, in a spirit of being what philosopher of science Adrian Curie calls methodologically omnivorous, right? If readers don't trust the quantitative models of far future ecosystems or hydrogeology, well, then the safety case experts would say, well, turn to the defense of the repository's engineered barrier system. And, if you don't trust that, well, why don't you turn to the engineering reports on mechanical strength tests that are done on the copper repository components? And if you don't trust those, why not turn to the qualitative scenarios, which kind of detail potential far future Finlands in prose, like detailed descriptions of how the world will be and the waxing and waning of future ice ages. They called this strategic redundancy, a term other experts use elsewhere. It's all about integrating many different fields, logic, so one potentially inaccurate assumption doesn't invalidate the wider range of projections. So to me, this basic epistemic stance, right, of being multi-perspectival, it's interdisciplinary, it's a pretty refreshing counterpoint to the myopic or reductionist scientism that produced so many of the intractable problems of the Anthropocene that we're seeing today. So that's not the only kind of line of safety case reasoning I look at in my book. I also look at analogies, analogical techniques. My informants studied a glacial ice sheet near Kangerlussuaq, Greenland, as an analog. And it's kind of like a present day stand-in feature that they're using for the sake of comparison to the future. And they use it to make rough inferences about the fate of a glacial ice sheet during and after the next ice age. They pointed to a Mesozoic copper deposit, which is preserved for 170 million years without succumbing to corrosion. And this is found encased in a mudstone over in Devon, England. And this becomes an analog for the repository's copper nuclear waste canisters. They also study Lake Lapajärvi, which is a crater lake that resulted from a meteor that crashed into Finland roughly 73 million years ago. They approached it as an analog for how Finland's landscape could change over the next several ice ages. But my informants didn't do this with sort of geophysical or geological features alone. They also had a whole separate section on archaeological analog studies. For example, they had this 2,100-year-old human cadaver that they found in China, or that was found in China, they didn't find it. And it was surrounded by clay and discovered alongside wood and vegetables and silk and meat. And they were interested in the clay's capacity to preserve the body and the artifacts across deep time. So, the safety case says, okay, the body's well preserved, its abdominal organs are intact, its skin is still completely there, some of its joints are even still movable, and this thing was never even mummified. Then the vegetables and meat around it are only partially decomposed. And why? Well, the clay around the cadaver made this airtight seal around it, right? So they take this information about clay and the artifacts of the cadaver and use it as an analog for how bentonite clay might preserve nuclear waste canisters over thousands of years. And what's interesting is there's problems with a lot of these analogs. There's a difference between, how a cadaver interacts with clay versus how nuclear waste interacts with clay or spent fuel. The latter is hot, so it has a different effect over time, or warm, depending on what point in the future you see it. So there's this whole office politics that I cover in the book about people bickering and battling and trying to undercut each other about whether an analog is valid or not. And some people are more comfortable making them and others are not. So, but what's interesting to me is the deep time journey they go on, right? So there's this bronze cannon that they look at from the Swedish warship Cronin. It's shipwrecked in the 17th century, submerged for almost 3 centuries in this Baltic seawater and seabed, pretty abrasive, corrosive conditions. Well, they pick that up and they say, okay, that's an analog for how Finland's and Sweden's copper nuclear waste canisters will or will not corrode in the far future, right? And then they study these Roman nails that they found, these iron nails, they're in Scotland, and they say, hey, these can be used as analogs for determining whether nuclear waste canisters, cast iron inserts will corrode in the future. So it's all about taking little pieces of the present and then using them to extrapolate more tangibly about the future, hopefully. So during my fieldwork, I found myself following these across time. I chronicle this analogical journey. It takes pit stops in the Roman Empire, future Earth that looks like Mars, in Gabon during our planet's earliest history. I go to other planets, like, ancient China, regions of South Africa in the year 2030, West Virginia during World War II. I look at nuclear waste analog studies, but also climate analog and space analog studies, which are analogous kinds of studies, if you will, that NASA's conducted. And I write about the limitations of analogical reasoning itself, right? There's limits to what a bronze cannon submerged in the sea for centuries can tell us about a copper nuclear waste canister buried in granite bedrock for millennia. There's limits to what native copper found in mud rock in Devon can really tell us about manufactured copper canisters that are found in clay in Okiluro. So many saw the differences between repository components and their analogs is just way too vast to make analogical connections between them. And they critiqued how safety case experts kind of cherry picked analog examples to support their own arguments, right? They didn't spend much time scouring the globe for counterexamples that would call the repository concept into question. Also, a lot of the counterexamples have already corroded and don't exist anymore. So they're only dealing with things that actually did survive across long-term time spans. So the point of the book is we should adopt this reflexive, multi-perspectival sensibility and then say analogs have something to teach us, even though they never offer us anything close to certainty. They have this empirical concreteness and materiality that's at least more tangible than empty speculation about the future. And inspired by these analog studies, I kind of put forth more reckonings, right? Like if we were all to integrate far-sighted flights of analogy into our day-to-day ponderings, could it sharpen our deep time reckoning skills? Could doing routine intellectual exercises, comparing different objects across time and space kind of help us reflect on similarities and differences between past, present, future worlds? And to what extent can these analogs help people speculate about what their home regions might look like tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, or even millions of years from now? This is kind of what historian Gabriel Hecht calls interscalar vehicles. She uses that term to describe objects we can kind of follow, to draw us to move across deep time, to human time, geological time, political time, as we follow their kind of biographies. So Hecht's concept helps me revisit these analogs as a means for connecting stories and timescales that are usually kept really far apart, right? And I didn't have to travel very far from Washington, D.C., where I worked, to begin following these analogs widely across time. For example, in 1922, excavators were clearing ground for building this Mayflower Hotel nearby. When they did, they found these fossilized bald cypress trees 20 feet below the surface. Things lived to be 1,700 years old. They grew roughly 100,000 years ago. And back then, America's capital city was a literal swamp. And today, the 4 bald cypress trees planted in the mid-1800s grow in Lafayette Square right near the White House. So when I walk by them, I describe in my book, the trees can kind of become interscalar vehicles, right? They become these kind of empirical analogical resources I can draw upon to help me think more widely across time and see my surroundings around me differently. They give me these ancient tree imageries I can use to envision and re-envision the nation's capital analogically as a prehistoric marshland. And that's just one example. I liked hiking through the Appalachian Mountains and the hills when I was living in DC too. Hundreds of millions of years ago, those are of course much larger mountains. Some say their elevations rivaled that of the Alps or the Rockies or the Himalayas. So when I'm hiking, I adopt this analog logic and I kind of reimagine my surroundings analogically by drawing from these imageries I already have in my head of what much taller mountain ranges look like today, right? So the book's all about making this analogy, this esoteric technical analogy work that, say, nuclear waste experts did, and then kind of doing it at the level of everyday experience, right? Like playing it out and stretching the momentary now of my hike into a much more distant history and future. And in my book, I challenge readers to do the same thing, right? So I suggest we all start asking questions like these, these are the reckonings at the end, if climate scientists say my current place of residence may someday have a desert ecosystem, well, to what extent can I draw on these mental imageries I have in my head of Arizona's deserts today to help me reimagine my area devoid of life? Say my current city is forecasted to look, like Ice Age Finland. Well, maybe I could draw upon imageries of Greenland's Kangerlussuaq ice sheet to help picture it. To what extent can I do that? That's a question one must always ask themselves. Could using online tools, one of the reckonings is about, like CGIAR's climate analogs application, if you've ever used it, that can help one compare one's home region, everyday life, future climate to analogous regions' current climates, right? And when we add new analogs to our inventories, we not only get better at sort of making new analogies, we also get better at breaking all the bad ones. Contemplative exercises like these can be compared to what geologist Marcia Bjornrud, who wrote the preface to my book, calls timefulness. It can make us more mindful that the world contains so many different visions, so many different elements of earlier worlds, and they're all sort of still with us in some way as we walk through our everyday momentary lives trapped in the now, right? So these are in the rocks beneath our feet, it's in the air we breathe, and every cell of our body is some trace of this distant past. The power of analogy helps get there. So the book develops a long-termist calisthenics for the mind, routine exercises the reader's encouraged to do, asking what degree of sameness or what kind of sameness must exist between two objects, to make or break an analogy between them. At what point do two objects no longer shed meaningful light on each other across time? Even if an analogy is imperfect, the book argues it can still add some value, some useful information can be extracted from it, and refine how we envision these plural futures as ecological crisis takes hold. And this can outfit us, I think, with a sort of an evidence-driven toolkit that's at least more tangible than navel-gazing speculation. It's imperfect, but it's better than nothing. If entire populations were to start doing things like this, or mental exercises or thought experiments like this, society's time horizons could change so much, a bit. But remember, deep time reckoning is ultimately a work of anthropology. It introduces several safety case experts to the readers in person. There's Risto, there's Laura, there's Taimi, there's Juha, there's Anders, there's Apo, there's Gustav. You meet them all. And most of the reckonings are positive, but some are cautionary tales, right? So in the last chapter, I tell about how the safety case project was thrown off course for several months in 2005 when a prolific but abrasive key expert died unexpectedly. To protect his identity, I named him Seppo. And what I followed in the field was how safety case experts were kind of summoning memories of Seppo, right? His specter, a lot of them said, still haunted their scientific community, but not in a literal way. But there are elements of Seppo still there. The afterlives of his expertise were still shaping how they made their long-term knowledge. And in ways, interconnected very closely with this expert that was reluctant to document how he did his modeling work and then suddenly died. You heard all these stories about Seppo's stubbornness and irritability and intellectual intensity, as well as his more jovial demeanor during sauna nights and workplace parties or trips abroad. Other informants are saying, like, what would Seppo do here while troubleshooting at work? And this chapter is a reminder kind of how challenging it can be to build intellectual infrastructures that outlast any single expert lifespan, right? So I hope that the reckonings I've gleaned from Seppo's tragic death story can help us work towards building more alongside societies. The book closes with this idea of predecessor preservation. We need to cultivate an ethic of predecessor preservation, carefully tending to and disseminating insights from prolific deep time reckoners, so their contributions to humanity's long-termism don't really die off upon their biological deaths. This can inch us towards resisting our current moment of intellectual, political, or ecological crisis. And I would say that in recent years, these crises of time reckoning have been pretty grave. Last year, the Trump administration advanced a proposal to reform key National Environmental Policy Act regulations to read, quote, I have it here, Effects should not be considered significant if they are remote in time, geographically remote, or the product of a lengthy causal chain. These conditions made CEPO's and other safety case experts' efforts to protect distant future worlds seem truly alien. And I'll close by saying, we can find some hope if this, not all of us, but some of us will find some hope in Joe Biden's electoral successes. But I worry that a simple change in presidential administration won't do too much to help us escape this toxic attentional economy we find ourselves in. There's a deeper problem of societal fixation on sort of knee-jerk social media battles, frenzied 24-hour cable news cycles, these short-sighted productivity metrics in academia and beyond, and the manic presentism that constrains so many different societies today, unpredictable shifts in shareholder returns, things like that. So my hope is deep time reckoning can help us escape the pervasive shallow time horizons imposed by what I opened with, the deflation of expertise, the global climate crisis, the Anthropocene, and other problems we're facing. Deep time reckoning, after all, is no longer just the province of geologists or evolutionary biologists or archaeologists, theologians, astrophysicists. It's now a collective societal responsibility, right? And as we move forward, I think the insights of long-sighted experts, like those even kind of arcane or esoteric or little known experts like safety case experts, those are going to be extremely useful and imperative to build a society that's more long-sighted. So we should listen to them, and anthropological engagement is really a way to capture the subtleties of their thinking as a way to ward off our planet's current ecological crisis. And that's about it. So thank you for listening. That's my speech. Now I can sit back and enjoy the panel. So thank you very much. I look forward to your questions.
Oh, thank you. Thank you, Vincent. That was great. And of course, now you'll get the peppering of questions for all your stuff.
Oh, yeah.
You did a great job. I was impressed by how we normally think of the future as one thing. Right. And part of what your book did is shows us that it's a set of possibilities that are extreme in some sense. So it makes it difficult. So thank you very much. We're going to open up to a panel conversation now. So I'd like to take a moment to introduce our two guests, and to our audience, put your thoughts and questions out on the chat. We'll try to pull them into the conversation. And then after the panel ends, we'll be going to the bar. So stay on if you can. Veena Venkatraman is the editorial page editor of the Boston Globe, a fellow at New America, and has taught at MIT. She's the author of The Optimist Telescope, named the best book of the year by Amazon Science Friday and National Public Radio. Veena spoke with Long Now Boston in March of 2020 on long-term thinking in an age of recklessness. So Gary, if you can run the spotlight and bring Veena and Vincent and me in, that would be helpful. That way everybody will be able to see them. So, and then I'll also introduce our second panelist tonight. Cristina Pareño Alonso is an architect, designer, and educator at the School of Architecture and Planning at MIT, where her research, Transtectonics, explores expanded temporal sensibilities in architectural material practice. She is the director of her own architectural firm, which is currently designing the permanent art installation Deep Time Stories of JP in the Hyde Square area of Jamaica Plains in Boston. So Cristina, welcome. Veena, welcome. So Veena, you've written your own book about long-term thinking. So what would you like to ask Vincent about tonight?
Thanks. Well, this is fun, and I'm really glad that I am getting to hang out with more Long Now people. I'm in often in a short time horizon these days, working at a daily newspaper, which is really more like a 24/7 time horizon. And Vincent, it was great to get to read your book, and I thought so appropriate to be able to read it in the context of knowing we were going to talk with the Long Now community, because here you've done this deep case study, which I think of these kinds of experiments as solving a specific problem, which is that we really have difficulty imagining the future past like 15 years into the future. And so in a way, Oncolo and the safety case is a case study not so dissimilar to the long now 10,000 year clock, in that it is, in your kind of description of it, a way of allowing people living in the present to anchor their imaginations to future worlds and be able to enrich and stretch their time horizons in the immediate. So it was great to think about having this conversation in that context, because I think of it as of a piece with the 10,000 year clock, in a way, in that way that it's bringing engineers to think really long term, and offering some insights about how we can think more long term in the present. I have a question for you, because I learned this fact from your book, despite having Finnish friends. I learned, so I know that you learned Finnish to do your research there over the course of many months. And one thing that you write in the book is that the Finns have no future tense. And so I wanted to ask you about the importance of a lexicon for this kind of thinking. How important is it to have vocabulary to describe the future? Is there another way in which vocabulary factors in? I think you talk about this a little bit in the book, but can you give people a preview of what the importance is of language in being able to have this kind of deep time reckoning?
Right. No, that's an excellent question. So a lot of anthropologists, cultural anthropologists these days, are very reluctant to make linguistic deterministic arguments. So I didn't go too far with that, but I did mention it because the lack of a future tense in Finnish, usually they use the conditional, like, or they'll say, I go to the store tomorrow, rather than I'm going to the store tomorrow, or I will go to the store tomorrow. Rather, there's no "will do this tomorrow." There is some interesting parallel that I don't take too seriously, but I also don't ignore it in the book, about it's imprudent to make confident projections, confident declarations about the future, either in everyday Finnish parlance or in a safety case model. The best you can do is make these this multifaceted, multidisciplinary array of projections, and then qualify it in a certain way. So there is something about the conditional voice, or not making a strong statement about the future. So that's part one. Number two, vocabularies are essential. My book ends with a deep time reckoning lexicon, and I think that's some of the most that's where anthropology adds the most value, because the anthropologist, if you're like a biological or evolutionary anthropologist, right, you go out and you study Homo erectus or Neanderthals, and you make projections about deep time into the past, or things like that. Cultural anthropologists usually don't do that. The way I engaged with deep time was looking for artifacts of deep time. Deep time is an artifact in my field site, right? And the artifact could be a PDF file that an informant made that talks about far future copper corrosion. It could be a report someone wrote about a far future ice age. And I collect all these artifacts, as any ethnologist does, and I bring them back to my university. I actually tried to put them in my Finnish nuclear artifacts in the Cornell Anthropology Museum, and they said no, because it didn't qualify as interesting enough, because they're literally just paperwork. So I collect these artifacts of deep time, and they're artifacts not necessarily of the far future. They're artifacts of 2012 to 2014 when I was there. So I'm really studying not deep time, but how my informants saw deep time during this 2-year period, 3-year period when I did fieldwork. So, but the power of that is that you can see this as a living laboratory for vocabularies, as you brilliantly point out. There's little terms people use, like multiple lines of reasoning, these analogical turns of phrase, these threads of thought that they web together. They're little things I can just bring back and assemble into a slightly more nuanced vocabulary for talking about the future. And I think that we're really at a symbolic stage right now as a society. We're really only at the early stage of changing our cognitions to be able to even talk or conceptualize the far future. So going out and then finding, whether it's the Long Now folks or nuclear waste experts or people at Svalbard Global Seed Vault, and collecting the little nuanced technical vocabularies they use to talk about the future, I think that's a perfect space for cultural anthropology and an important endeavor. There's also a book called Anthropocene Unseen, a Lexicon, which a bunch of, I think, Anand Pandayan and Simony Howe, the anthropologists, put out this lexicon, and I have a chapter in it called Generation. It's both about nuclear energy generation, a new coming of, as baby boomers retire, there's a new generation of nuclear experts and trying to cultivate talent pools in the industry. So that sense of generation. And then also, Gen 4 reactors, they talk about like these advanced reactors they're working on. So coming up with a lexicon for talking about deep time is step one. And then doing these mental exercises for envisioning deep time in your everyday life, I think, is step two. And I thank you for highlighting that, because you really got to the heart of what I was getting at there. And
Vincent, it sounds like you're trying to find ways of getting little hooks in the human brain to really bring us out, and whether it's analogs or artifacts, or being your talk about heirlooms and the importance of getting the person just out of the normal way of thinking about things. Christina, why don't you jump in and ask Vincent a question?
Thank you, George. Very, very excited to be here with you guys in the long now. Thank you. And Vincent, great talk, really, really inspiring. And I love the way Yuvina has started us off with this idea of the lexicon, and as George has continued, like kind of the idea of these artifacts, these material analogies, no, that Vincent, you used to see what we can learn from Onkalo, right? What we can learn from those material analogies in order to acquire deep time that you claim is very necessary, right? If we are to be planetary stewards. And so I'm curious about, I think it's clear that we are talking about the importance of deep time thinking, the importance to pause, to take a long horizon approach to the future. But at the same time, we are in a moment where people are stressed, people are rushed. There is this huge sense of urgency that has to do with imminency of survival, or with like kind of, if you think of surviving the pandemic right now, but also social and political uncertainties, or economical precarity. And so to me, the need to learn deep time literacy comes associated with a challenge, which is that the multiple global crises operate at very different timescales simultaneously, right? So that we have to keep in mind the timescales of the urgent now, right? Of us living in this planet, if you think of all the current catastrophes of climate change, but then at the same time, the timescales of the deep future of them, the future generations to come. And so we are constantly having to toggle between these temporal dimensions. And I wonder if in this claim that you pose to us of deep time, you consider these dualities as essential in the conundrum, and how does it enter your work?
Yes, it's really interesting. So, you mentioned time literacy. I guess that links directly to the idea of, stage one of making a society, mass populations more comfortable with thinking deep time, is to just collect a vocabulary and help people make more hair-splitting distinctions. The classic example from really old school anthropology, it's kind of snickered at sometimes today, is, okay, the Inuit have 20 different words for snow, or 40 different words for snow rather, therefore they can see 40 different types of snow. And there have been tests more recently, on Amazonian societies, for instance, that have so many different words for green because they're living in a place and they have to make botanical distinctions between, like, okay, that's poison and that's medicine and that's yummy and that's disgusting and that's rare, blah, blah, blah. So these are kind of the things that anthropology is coming from usually. And they're saying, like, okay, if you hold someone from that group up, show them these different colors, they will be able to identify more greens than a Westerner would, or someone living in New York City would, because they have more words for it. So a lot of that's kind of been discredited. A lot of people say, the pulling the rug out of it is that there actually aren't 40 words for snow in Inuit language. That turned out to be fictional. But the overall thrust of it has become really interesting. I think that type of thinking should be applied to time, as you say. And there are people like the sociologist Timescape, Barbara Adams, she writes about timescapes thinking, or people like Gabriel Hecht talks about, multi-scalar, multi-temporal analysis. These are ways of sitting and reflecting, similar, being able to split more hairs at what are the different timescapes intersecting in my everyday life right now? Is it an intergenerational timescape? Is it a multi-millennial timescape? Is it I have to drop the kid off at the dentist and then soccer practice, and then I have to come home and write my report, and then I have something due tomorrow? But at the same time, I'm doing this on bedrock that's 1 billion years old, and I'm breathing in air that has a release, from a carbon emission that happened decades ago. These things are all happening at once. So that sort of linguistic precision of divvying up words, I think, needs to be applied to time. As I said in the beginning about sempiternity, everlastingness, eternality, and foreverness in the theological discussions. Those are just distinctions you can make to talk about time. So I think you're very right to say, time literacy is very much about getting a vocabulary for making these temporal distinctions and seeing how they intersect dynamically in your everyday life. It's always already all those timescapes at once, is what I'd say.
Could I jump in and ask Christina a question? So I thought that's an interesting, really important question, because you can hold in mind future generations and this timescale that Vincent has been talking about, and yet with the implication of that, right? The implication of thinking that future generations are really important, and maybe as important as the people I'm in the Zoom room with right now, or the people who are in my house right now. The idea that these people who are not yet born could be at least much more important than we treat them today, right? Through social discounting and these other policymaking measures, we treat them like they're basically valueless, worthless. But imagine if we have this kind of deep, long time horizon, and we suddenly think of these future generations as important, as valuable, or at least much more so. The implication of that is that we actually need to act urgently, because our emissions today are so long-lived in the atmosphere when it comes to climate change, for example. Or the implication of that is we need to really accelerate our investment in scientific research, knowing that it's long-tailed and the benefits come way in the future. And so I'm just really curious, Christina, from your perspective, when you think about, the art installations you're doing and how materiality comes into architecture, how you are thinking about those dualities. Are you trying to create, because I think of architecture, and maybe you can qualify this or correct me, but I think of it as trying to help human beings, right, relate to the world in some way, and imagine the world in some way, but also inhabit the world in some new way. And so when you think about design and the potential for art and the potential for architecture to address that duality, how do you think about that? How do you think about the materials? How do you think about that tension?
Yeah, that's a great question, Vina. Thank you for that. I agree that thinking about the future generations to come may force us to act urgently, but I think sometimes urgent matters that we think we should solve now are in detriment of those future generations, and so we would be acting urgently but in a different way. And I think that's why it's important to have the full scope and the full spectrum. And my installations, for example, my installation in Boston, in Jamaica Plain, that is called Deep Time Stories of Jamaica Plain, is really trying to bring awareness to these different timelines that we are inhabiting. So it's really about the project. It's a collaboration with the Hyde Square Task Force, or basically it's driven by their desire to celebrate the history of the site. But then what we turn the history of the site is to become about all the stories that have been heard and have not been heard, and of the people of Hyde Square, but also geological narratives, right? Like Hyde Square sits on a bedrock of Roxbury conglomerate that has been there for 600 million years, right? And so some of the stories of the people will be carved into this stone, somehow really making us understand that we are part of something that is much longer. and that will be there longer. So we think of it's a permanent art installation, and there we are thinking permanent in terms of the, let's say, new immortals, we call the materials, like kind of rock, old immortals, rock and fossils, and new immortals, plastics and plastic agglomerates. And so it's really about understanding this double condition. So that's a lot of what I do in my work, and I think it's a lot of perhaps this could be another question that now I throw to Vincent. I feel that this obviously you wrote this book before the pandemic, right? And yet I feel that that the pandemic has radically changed our perception of time.
Right.
Right. It has put ourselves in a situation with endless days at home, where week and weekends like kind of merge. And I wonder if the pandemic has affected your view on how to produce deep time literacy.
Right. Well, there's one thing that really that is on the nose, that the WIPP nuclear waste repository in Carlsbad, New Mexico, so the transuranic nuclear waste repository, low and intermediate level waste, is buried there from the mostly Cold War trash from the Cold War nuclear weapons complex, etc. They have a huge COVID outbreak down there, 200 something cases deep in the repository. A repository has very little airflow, and it's the ultimate indoor space in a way. So you get the problem of these like chains of COVID infections at this repository. I mean, and that becomes the perfect site to start thinking about, man, these are, you know, timefulness in Bjornrod's sense of communing with, wow, this radical contingency that a week before the outbreak, we couldn't have conceived. We always knew that a pandemic was possible. You know, the previous, you know, Bush, Obama administration, they were all warning us, you know, all things like that. We knew it could happen, but when it actually happened, no one knows it's going to happen the next day. So that temporality enters into the frame. The temporality of infection and convalescence and recovery enters into the frame. The temporality of all the different nuclear waste generator sites across the Department of Energy complex, going across America's highways towards the repository, getting, you know, buried in the repository comes into play. The legal agreements in each of those states to get a certain amount of waste out of the state in time enter into play. The deep timeframes of burying nuclear waste and plutonium's long half-life enter into play. And that all sort of intersects in this one moment that as an anthropologist becomes a fascinating case study for reflecting on time. And my colleague Anna Waitzelbraun, who did an ethnographic study of the International Atomic Energy Agency, she wrote an article called Chronotopes, playing with Bakhtin's sense of chronotopes in literature. And chronotopes, I mean, it's kind of a interesting formulation. I think but basically, like, it can feel like you're in a different world almost. Like I'm in Canada, and you know, people who were born the same month as me in the US are now already vaccinated. I'm looking several months ahead. So what stage you are in, say, a place developing contact tracing, a place developing instituting vaccination, makes you feel like you're almost in a different time zone of how early or late you are in the pandemic. Like same in the early on, if you were in Northern Italy, you were at a different stage of the pandemic than you were in, you know, rural Idaho before it broke out there. So that's a profound place to reflect on different chronotopes or polytemporality or intersections of different timescapes in a certain moment. And there can be a wellness benefit to this too. It denaturalizes the now for you and makes you feel more distant from the present moment. So all these books that are coming out, Helen Gordon's Notes from Deep Time, my book, Deep Time Reckoning, David Ferrier's Footprints, Future Fossils, a few years ago, Robert McFarlane's Journey into Deep Time, Marcy Bjornrod's Timefulness. These are all, or even Hugh Raffles's book, Book of Unconformities. They're all happening at a certain moment. And I think they're really, and none of these people really knew each other. They just independently made these books. That's how we met. We didn't know each other, right? Like we just happened to be interested in this parallel time. There's something about the historical moment. Bina's book too is a great example, which I'm a fantastic example of, you know, these are all happening at once because there's something about now that makes us want to think about this. And the books are selling in an academic register or a pop register everywhere. It's fascinating.
So the reality of having to bury this nuclear waste that we've created is impressing upon the imagination now.
Right.
The pressures of COVID are pressing upon the imagination now and causing us to try to think more globally and more long term. And the pressures of the Anthropocene are creating this intensity right now. But at the same time, they also create short-term distractions, which leads us to that more sense of, the urgency and got to do something. And this raises a question. Somebody, Grant from the chat room asked the question. It seems like you paint a picture of this issue of dealing with the safety case as so difficult, so incredibly long-term, so difficult. Is there not a message in there about maybe we don't want to go down this path in the first place?
What path specifically?
Creating nuclear waste in
our
planet.
Oh, yes. Which is the fascinating, that's the paradox, or that's the, I don't know what the adjective, that's the something of nuclear waste, is that we didn't ask for this. This was made by an extremely small group of Manhattan. The whole atomic age was, created in a classified setting, extremely small group of Manhattan Project scientists come together with this large secret cities complex in the US. Now we're seeing the nuclear age is suddenly here. It's not something we voted on. So it's a very undemocratic technology in a way, in that sense. So basically, like, it's too late is what I have to say. I mean, it's already here. That was interesting too. A lot of my field informants weren't pro-nuclear. They were like, they didn't even believe the nuclear baseload energy, climate change types of arguments. Some of them, most of them did, opted into that. But what really comes out is this pragmatic ethos among Finland's nuclear waste experts of there's already the waste here. It's immutable. And under our current technology, maybe it won't be in 100 years, but since it's here, it's not worth discussing. I wish we didn't do this in the first place. That would be their attitude. My attitude would be, yeah, I wish it wasn't there also. So we have to do something. That's the whole basis of their pragmatic kind of like reductive is necessary, oversimplifying is necessary, multiple lines of reasoning is necessary. We have to create something that's credible, but not a perfect one-to-one representation of the future. It's born out of the immutability of nuclear waste and the irreversibility of the genie being out of the bottle.
Bina, Christine, another question for Vincent?
Or I can ask them one.
You're welcome to.
Yes, Bina, your book is fantastic. I was curious, you make an interesting distinction between just because I'm talking about these, if we're have greater time literacy, if we have a lexicon, if we have a vocabulary, then mass consciousness can grow. And I think that what I'm saying is true there, and that's my project. Your book got me thinking, even if we have this vocabulary, will we act on it? You can have really good forecasts, you can know something's happening, but getting people to have the foresight to act on it is a totally different thing. So how do you see Optimist Telescope iterating with my book or my talk today?
Yeah, in a lot of ways. And thanks for pointing that out. I mean, yes, one of the insights of the book is that a good forecast is not the same as good foresight. And so that we have this big gap between honing our predictive powers in a lot of senses, whether it's climate models or hurricane forecasting, or even knowing the half-life of nuclear waste, right? Like that's not something that, pre-Enlightenment or pre-modern technology we would know. And so with that knowledge, we don't necessarily, right, make the decisions that that are responsible across time horizons. We still make decisions like not to evacuate before a really accurate storm forecast. Human beings make these decisions, knowing about climate change for decades, not really acting on them in our societies. And so that there's this real gap, and the need, really, the Optimist Telescope is about the need to bridge that gap between what we can possibly know about the future, which of course, as you point out, the deeper you go into the future, the less confidence we have for most things. With climate models, it's a little bit counterintuitive in that way. We actually have more confidence looking farther out across the century than we do knowing what's going to happen in the next decade. But for a lot of problems, for most problems, the deeper into time you look, the more possibilities, the more degrees of freedom there are, as you pointed out. And so how do you bridge that gap, I think one of the answers is imagination. And so I think of aspects like the 10,000 year clock, the art installation that Christina's working on, or Onkolo, as partially about helping people in the here and now be able to inhabit futures that we have yet to see, futures with unprecedented changes, because our cognitive capacity to contemplate the future is really constrained by what we've experienced in the immediate past. And there are many ways to extend that imagination, from having an engineering project to having a larger perspective of historical analogies. And importantly, I guess one of the key ways that I think about deep time and write about deep time, I wrote about the project to create a nuclear waste site, to mark the nuclear waste site in New Mexico in my book, in the final chapter of my book. And I spent some time with one of the archaeologists who was informing the project, and she was thinking back to ancient artifacts and their disintegration over time, what survives over time, to think about how you could mark this nuclear waste site to warn people generations in the future, thousands of years in the future. And there was this sense of futility to that because of the inability we have to actually know what language those people are going to understand, what symbols. There were these silly ideas like, let's mark it with a skull and crossbones, and realizing that even now, a skull and crossbones could mean poison, or it could mean that you're at a pirate theme park, right? So there are these sort of ways in which we already have a fluidity of understanding of our symbols. And so there is this sort of inability to create what I think of as time capsules, where we lock in a particular plan and expect it to be actually the reality that future generations deal with. But the way I kind of, I guess, reconcile that, which I think for me becomes both a process of anchoring the imagination in the deep future, but also understanding that we can't plan that far with any kind of confidence, is to think about these shared heirlooms in society. And so thinking not, imagining many generations ahead, knowing we don't have confidence, but being able to pass on particular traditions or particular ways of doing things, knowledge, to at least one or two generations ahead, so that iteration of planning for the future continues, that idea of making meaning continues. And Christina and I have talked before about the Ise shrine, the Shinto shrine in Japan, which is, rebuilt on a regular cycle, so that each generation is learning how to rebuild that same structure. And that's the kind of way that I see bringing a practicality to your lexicon. And the philosophical idea of deep time is to think about these methods and examples and analogies for actually being able to regenerate something over time. And those analogies can even come from, like, the Pando aspen colony, right, which clones itself and then persists over time. To your point about looking at the trees around you, or looking at these places for evidence. And I think those analogies can even be quite practical in bridging that gap between foresight and a lexicon and a philosophy, and the real actions we need to act like better ancestors.
Yeah, that's extremely articulate way to put it. And it's also interesting, I read an article recently called Deep Time Organizations. And the organization, it's like some of the longest continuously running organizations in the world, right? One of them is the company that builds those shrines, because they constantly have to live across generations to rebuild according to the exact same method. So, and one of the arguments of the article is, something, if you connect yourself to some perennial timeless issue, there is a greater chance that your organization will last a long time. Like Anti-Slavery International is another example. What is it? Lifeboat. The people who go out and save people at sea since the 1800s is another one. The Masons is another one. Community interactions, the Imperial House of Japan, etc. So anyway, that's an interesting a part of this. There's also another book that came out this year called, I have it right over there, by Rosemary Joyce, The Future of Nuclear Waste, that talks about the use of land art and then conveying things to far future generations of nuclear waste repository sites. Like you said, do you get an image of Edvard Munch's The Scream and put it at the site? Do you have a huge field of thorns to warn people not to build there? What's interesting is in Finland, they didn't like all this stuff. They said that is a hubristic American overconfidence, which is, and I'm not sure whether I agree with the statement, but their approach is to not mark the site and then literally put it on this island kind of in Western Finland with no resources where people are unlikely to dig, and then don't put a monument on it, and then literally just put a fence around it, cap it off so it blends in perfectly with the landscape and forget. So it's the complete opposite of the WIP or Yucca Mountain ones. So a frequent gripe of my field informants in Finland is that when Michael Madsen, for instance, who made that documentary we saw the clip of in the beginning, came and made his documentary about like, how do we create monuments? The Finns say, because it's supposed to be about Finland, but they're like, that's not our problem. That's from the US. You're imposing American assumptions on the Finnish project, which is interesting. But they're fascinating questions. And it's interesting you flag those too, because I think that really gets to the heart of it.
Yeah, that's great. And as one of our, on the chat room, John said on the chat room that maybe the answer is that we have to make it the responsibility of succeeding generations to pass that information on.
The comic priesthood, yeah.
Continuity process that we need to play. This has been a great conversation. We're going to take a segue to go to the bar and refresh a little bit. So we'll just do a formal close. We'll open up to the conversation to anybody that can stay. Thank you, Vincent, for an incredible book and an incredible presentation. Thank you very much. Thank you, Bina and Christina, for participating in a fascinating panel. It was a great conversation, stretching the mind, getting us out into the future. And as you pointed out, Vincent, there are a lot of authors out there and books, and maybe we're at a cultural change point when we're going to be able to get long-term thinking really embedded in our culture. So, and to our audience, thank you all for joining the conversation tonight. We're going to head to the virtual bar now, but just a couple of reminders: visit the website, stay in touch on social media. Please consider joining as a member if you haven't already. And don't forget to sign up for our next event on Eventbrite, Dear Tomorrow, which will be a different way of approaching the future and trying to kind of emotively take ourselves and picture that future. And then also, okay, yeah, we've got our logo slide up, and the next one I think is the Dear Tomorrow event. Waiting for that to show. There's the Dear Tomorrow event. And then also May 2nd, the event with 2269.co. You'll be getting a notification and invitation if you're signed up on the website or you're signed up on Eventbrite for participation in the pre-event survey for that event coming up in May. All dealing with many of the same things we're trying to struggle with tonight. So also want to thank the production team, Gary, Kim, Mary, great job. Grant, thank you very much.